For you guys to still play with him. And how long are we playing? Like around 15 more minutes. So I'm gonna Kirtan. Ladies and gents, I'm gonna Kirtan. Here we go.
I just want to thank the band real quick. We have my friend Darshan here, straight from Temple of Solomon. Anyone? Eileen, thank you so much. Your beautiful voice and amazing. Matthew, the guitar, keeping the grooves going. And Virginia on the viola. Thank you so much. My name is Madhu Man. I'm here to serve you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Yes, I do.
Yes.
Deva ki. So, when I was about 14 years old, I wrote him an email and I asked him if he could bless me on Kirtan so that I could do Kirtan in my life. At that time, I really wanted to do Kirtan. That's what I wanted to do. And it's like, please, could you please bless me so I can do Kirtan in my life? And his reply was, yes, you have my blessings to do Kirtan for your own benefit and for the benefit of the entire universe. So after this,
how old was when I first heard your Kirtan?
I think it was about 11, 12 in Rio de Janeiro.
I can just see you in my mind. I can see you sitting there with a...
Yeah. So thank you so much. I'm very grateful to be here and be able to talk again. Oh, the stage changer? Yeah.
Jaya Jaya Prabhupada. Jaya 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 Jaya
Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare,
Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna,
Jai Gaura Premanande. And to keep the house rocking, we have Madhuri Pura, who is Prabhu. Join us. A big applause to Madhuri, also known as Madhu. I saw you YouTube and you were amazing. Thank you for sharing your time, ladies and gents, your energy for this special event. Alrighty, ladies and gents, Madhu here with us. Is that okay to play the piano? What was that? The piano? Is that okay, Gus? Is that okay to play the piano?
Yeah.
You don't mind?
No, no. Take out the key.
Because I can never do piano kirtan from you, I can't.
Yeah.
If that's okay, this not a big
Too much.
Mucho lío traer el piano. I can play any piano.
Yes.
My only request is please chant in such a way that Srimacharya will be pleased, because if he's pleased, certainly we're pleasing Krishna, everyone will be fully successful. I can just play the guitar if that's easy. Would that be easy? And then like a G major, maybe Srila Charya Dev Ki. Srila Prabhupada Ki. Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasari Gaura Hare Krishna Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna Hare Hare, Hare Rama Hare Please listen now. Krishna, 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 Krishna Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna Hare Hare, Rama Hare Rama, Rama Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare
going to the LA temple right now who can give a ride to our number by any chance? No? Okay, I'll take it.
Okay, thank you, Madhuri. Bravo. Big applause for Madhuri. Bravo. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we have the one and only. The one and only. Si la celadera. Chula number one. A big applause for Shila.
I just wanted to check in.
verdad, sí, San 19. Oh boy. Let's start out with like you're not recording. Okay, no bad jokes. No bad jokes.
Thank you. Break the status. Break the status.
Yeah, it's live, so I can't do
It's live. I can't do
Sure did. Okay. Do you want me to signal you for like an hour? Do you want me to put the clock?
I look so stupid.
You're right.
You're right.
Can you open it? Open it?
Yeah, because this chair is hard to be serious.
You want some pilas? Extra pilas?
Oh, okay.
La chica.
Lo abandoné dos veces. Con el casal lo abandoné dos veces. Me dijo acá.
Sí, sí.
Y después vamos a ver el vídeo y preparamos
¿Se acuerdan? Podemos empezar con las preguntas. Y algunos de los que quieren.
voy a invitar. Y lo otro, acuérdense que vamos a invitar a todos para que se lleven los libros que vienen de
Sí, sí.
So after your class, we're going to prepare a video.
Yeah.
I'm going to put it here when you start. So if you want to, like maybe around the hour, like ask if anybody.
You gotta get the thermometer, people get donations, you know. Oh, is that one?
Yes. 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 It's working for me now. Are you gonna start with questions, or are you gonna?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, I can.
They're testing.
It does. Okay, we're gonna start the questions and answer section.
If anyone would like to come in and sit down here on the rug, we have some seats. The same price.
Mark a day.
El León. Hare Krishna. As we say in this business. How do I get one? So, thank you all very, very much for coming. It's truly the more the merrier. And last night I spoke. Some of you might have been afraid that I was never going to stop, but never going to. So, unfortunately, we did have time for your questions yesterday. So, if anyone had a question, would like to ask a question, now is the chance. If you have a question like this. So, do we have a microphone for people who want to ask questions? Sí, en español también.
Mismo precio.
Okay. Nada de ruido en la cocina. So if anyone had a question or has a question, we have a microphone here.
No, he already.
My last question. So yesterday you were talking about how it's difficult but not impossible to reconstruct this ancient text, because using, I think, was it the Bhagavatam, as a sort of an overall guide.
Yes.
Which is not corrupt and is well accurate. And you can, so I think you said, so let's say, so using that as a guide, and some of the corrupt texts and texts from different regions of India that may be India, not part of the original text. So if you have something, like let's say you have something in the Srimad Bhagavatam that says, okay, this is sort of an overview of what happened. And maybe you have like several versions of that same story. And they maybe come from different regions or different versions of the ancient text. How do you, of course, you probably never get 100% accuracy. Of course, you want to never get as possible. How do you sort of determine which side or which story or which version of this overview is the correct one, the authentic ancient, as opposed to something that's either corrupt or made up?
In the Maha-bharata. So in the Maha-bharata. Very good question. Very good question. That's my brother, older brother, Alan. So because he's my brother, I'm not going to answer his question. So, in the Bhagavatam, which I explained last night, we have a text which is not corrupted. And also, just a word about the epistemology here, like the process of knowing. I'm obviously dodging this question by bringing it all in. And that is that there is a process by which knowledge is said to be purely transmitted. And that process is described by Krishna himself in the Bhagavad Gita. In chapter 4, so maybe I'll say a word about that, and then I will get to your question. In chapter 4 of the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna begins the chapter by saying, I'll give you the Sanskrit so you can see what it sounds like. Evam parampara praptam imang rajarsayo vidu. Whoops, sorry, that's not the first verse. I'm too ecstatic. So Krishna begins it. That's actually the third verse. Krishna says, "Imang vivasate yogam protavanaham abhiyam." That I spoke this unperishing. He uses the word yoga, which here means like the spiritual science. And so Krishna says that I spoke this unperishing spiritual science, Vivaswan, who's considered to be one of the great authorities in the universe. And then Vivasan Manave Praha. Vivaswan spoke to Manu, who was the great lawgiver in this culture. And also it was his son. And then Manu Ikshwaka Vebravi. And then Manu spoke to his son Ikshwaka, who was a great king. So after explaining that, Krishna then says, Evam, thus, Parampara Praptam, that this science, the spiritual science, comes down through what he calls parampara, which means a succession. It literally means a succession. And evam parampara praptam imang rajar shayobidu. And the great kings and the great sages understood it in that way. That's how they understood it. And then Krishna says, this is very interesting because Krishna himself, thousands of years ago, talks about the problems of text transmission, that texts tend to be corrupted over time. So Krishna says, Sakali neha mata yoga nasta parandapa, which means that literally by great time, Mahakala, by great time, this spiritual science was lost. Sakali neha mata yoga nasta parandapa. And then Krishna says, Saivaya mayate jad yoga prota puratana. Today, I am speaking to you that same spiritual science. Saivaya mayate jad yoga prota, that primeval, that ancient science. Saivaya mayate jad yoga prota puratana. And so then Krishna explains why he has chosen Arjuna to receive this science, which Krishna already said is avyayam, literally unperishing. It's an unperishing science, so it's eternal, but it can be lost over time in the sense that people forget it, people misunderstand it. And Krishna says that he's speaking to Arjuna because bhakto asi, because you are my devotee, you are devoted to me. He didn't say because you're a great yogi, a great hatha yogi, or a great meditator, or you have different kinds of mystic powers, or a great scholar. He says to Arjuna, bhakta. Bhakta means a devotee, or it can also mean that you are devoted. Because you are devoted to me, and you are my friend. Sakha means friend. Bhakto si me, of mine. Sakha, cheti. And therefore, rahasyam yetarutamam, this supreme mystery, because even if you study human history, to finally figure out what the absolute truth is, there's so many different theories, and therefore Krishna calls this a rahasyam, with something which is very confidential, which is mysterious, which is difficult to understand. He said it's a supreme mystery, which is the ultimate identity of God. And so Krishna says that I am speaking it to you now because you love me, because you are devoted to me. And we see that throughout the Maha-bharata and the Bhagavatam that Arjuna was a great, famous devotee of Krishna and my friend. And so therefore we accept knowledge coming down in the same process. So if we study historically, we can see that since the time of Krishna, we can trace how the knowledge has come down to us through pure souls who taught it to us. And so that is sort of one of the bedrock epistemic claims, so to speak, that one gets this pure knowledge. I mean, even for example, take anything. Take, for example, modern microbiology. I mean, there are certain experts, and they take students at an undergraduate, then graduate level, postdoctoral level. They teach their students, some of them become teachers. And so it's not just this is not like a mystical process, it's common sense that we hear from people that know, and then they teach, they have students, and those students become teachers and so on. So that's what Krishna is describing. So I want to use a popular modern cliche, drill down a little deeper in this. And so the point where Krishna says to Arjuna that I've chosen you to receive this knowledge because you are devoted and you are my friend. I can trust you. I mean, this is common sense. We don't, actually people do. I mean, at least when we were growing up, you didn't go out and just tell all your most intimate secrets to people you've never met before. Although now that has become the thing to do. So I grew up in a very different world where people had a little modesty. So let's say it's natural that you reveal your intimate secrets to people you trust, people who have proven themselves to be your true friend, people who have proven that they actually love you, and who will act for your own best interest. It's to those people we open our hearts. And Krishna is doing the same thing. So another very important verse, because the Gita is famous for not being fanatical. It's not a fanatical work. It's what I call philosophical monotheism as opposed to tribal monotheism. It's not that my God can beat up your God, but it's philosophical monotheism. And therefore, Krishna in the Gita teaches many processes of yoga, jnana yoga, dhyana yoga, or in other words, connecting to God through philosophical study, dhyana yoga, connecting by meditation, karma yoga, connecting to God by simply doing what you do in the world, your vocation or your family or whatever, but you offer that to God, because that's called karma yoga. And so Krishna teaches all these processes. But then he says in the last verse of chapter 6, verse 47, showing off. So in verse 647, Krishna says, Yoginam api sarve sham. But indeed of all yogis, all spiritual practitioners, of all of them, madgatena antaratmana, the one who literally has gone to me or given themselves to me with their, again, literally antaratma, inner self. The English word interior or inner is cognate with, linguistically connected to the Sanskrit anta, interior, which means interior or within. So Krishna says, one who has gone to me, this is very literal translation, with their inner self, because the word atma in Sanskrit, the word self, it's very much like English. Like you can talk about self in a very high philosophical sense, or you can say, do it yourself, or you can say, yeah, I'm going to the self-service car wash. So in Sanskrit, if you were going to a self-service car wash, you would use the word atma, like self-service. So it's very much like in English, the word atma it can be the reflexive pronoun, or it can mean, in philosophical language, it could mean the self in the highest spiritual sense. And so Krishna here is using, and so therefore Krishna, to distinguish that I'm talking about the Atma in that highest sense, he says Antaratma, your inner self, your true self. So Krishna says that yogi nama pi sarvesham, indeed of all yogis, madgaten antaratmana, one whose inner self has gone to me, shraddhavan, and with faith, bhajate jo mam, worships me, adores me. These are English translations. I'm trying to get a little bit into Sanskrit because the Sanskrit is a little more, there's a lot more going on beyond the English translation. So, for example, Krishna says, Antaratmana, so the word faith. In Sanskrit, there are two words that mean faith. One is the word astikya, which simply means you believe in God. You believe there's a God. You don't doubt that. Because the word asti in Sanskrit means he or she exists. So that sort of entry-level faith where you just believe that God exists. So from the word asti, he or she is, from which we get German ist, French phonetically est, Spanish es, English is. That's all the Sanskrit asti. So just believing that God exists, I believe in God, is astikya, from the word asti. But the word shraddha means more than that, although it's often, you'll see it, most times it'll be translated in books as faith. But shrad actually means trust, and it's actually cognate with like, Greek and Latin words for heart, cor, and so on. So, and tha means to place. So when you put your heart in something, you don't just believe it exists, but you actually put your heart in it. You put all your trust in it. That's the word shraddha, and that's the word Krishna uses here. He doesn't use the word faith, where you merely believe that God exists. And actually, the word shraddha is sort of formally defined in a very important text written about roughly 500 years ago, maybe 480 years ago, called the Chaitanya Charitamrita in Sanskritic Bengali. Because in Bengali, where the much adored Hare Krishna movement came from, there's what is called Sanskrit, and all the Vulgate languages, the modern languages of India, say Hindi or Bengali and so on, there's kind of like a somewhat crude vernacular, or there's sort of, you're speaking in sort of in a more sophisticated way, more literary, more intellectual. They use a very Sanskritic form of that language. So this is like that Sanskritic Bengali that says Shraddha Shabde, which means by the word Shraddha. Vishwasa Kahe, one is really saying Vishwasa. And Vishwasa, again, a Sanskrit word, means trust, confidence. And what is that trust? Krishna Bhakti Koile. Simply by giving my love to Krishna with service, serving with love. If you love someone, you serve them. That's the symptom. You actually love someone. You want to do whatever they need. So Krishna Bhakti Koile Sarva Karma Krita Hoy. The word karma, which is most familiar in English as like what's your karma or so on. But actually the word karma is most often used in the literal sense just to mean action, something you do intentionally. And then of course it comes to mean the system of karma. And by the way, it's cognate with, sorry, I have these linguistic attacks. It comes from a Sanskrit root from which we get English words like create, from the same root as karma. So in this sarva karma krita hoy, every duty you have in life, your duty, let's say, to keep your health, to keep the health of people you love, your financial obligations, so you and your loved ones can live peacefully, ethical, moral duties, social duties. The idea is that everything will be done if you can somehow or other love God. That everything will be done. And so that's the word shraddha that Krishna uses, going back to this verse 647 in Bhagavad Gita, that of all yogis, the one whose inner self, deepest self, has gone to me. And the word bhajate, you've heard the word bhajan, I mean, right? Everyone talks about bhajan, when people sit down and chant with harmoniums, and you know that. It's actually the word bhajan, like it's like when you pronounce this word budge, like I'm not going to budge. People say bhajan commonly in America, which literally means a container. But anyway, so the Sanskrit word bhajan comes from the root bhaj, B-H-A-J. And by the way, it's the same root from which you get the word bhakti. If you just, T in Sanskrit, Ti is a feminine suffix, which makes feminine words like bhakti, shruti, and all that. So the word bhaj is very interesting because it can mean to share. So to do bhajan means you share your love with God or other people who are worthy of your love. It can mean that. And for example, there's like, if you wonder, thousands and thousands of years ago, in this ancient civilization, how did people in Sanskrit pop the question? How did people propose to each other? And so the Maha-bharata is very interesting because sort of a typical way that in ancient Sanskrit that someone says, will you marry me? Is they say, bhajaswa mam bhajantam tvam, which means sort of share your life with me as I will share my life with you, or adore me as I am adoring you. And so that's sort of the most common way that people propose marriage in this ancient culture. So all that is the word bhaj, which means to share, to devote oneself. And so Krishna here uses the verb that shadavan bhajate jomam, one who adores me, one who shares their life with me with love. Krishna says, Same yukta tamo mataha, is considered to be the greatest yogi and the one who loves God. It's interesting because the word yoga actually means the same thing as the word religion in its linguistic sense. Because, like a ligament that connects things in the body, so ligare means to connect. In Latin, so religare, religar in Portuguese, religar. So to reconnect with God, which is the same thing the word yoga means, which is interesting. So anyway, the way Krishna says that someone is the greatest yogi, I think is interesting. So, and that is, the word yoga comes from a Sanskrit root. Sanskrit is sort of like an organic language in the sense you have these verb action roots and then stems grow out of roots and then you get words. And so the word yoga comes from the word yuj, which means to connect, which we still have in English, by the way, that Sanskrit root, and words like conjugal, which means very intimate connection, or to yoke, to connect two things, to yoke them. That's from the same root as yoga. So as you all know, the past passive participle, which means, why am I telling you what you all know? So the past passive participle of that root is yukta, which is a word used a lot in the Gita, because if yoga means to link or connect, the word linked, or connected is yukta. So when someone, in other words, when someone has achieved success in yoga, they are yukta. They're actually connected. They're not practicing connection. They're actually connected. That's the word yukta. And Sanskrit tama, in this connection, is a suffix meaning to the highest degree. So yukta tama means connected in the highest sense. And of course, yukta means has most successfully practiced yoga. And so Krishna says the one whose inner self, whose deepest self has actually come to me and who adores me with real trust, trusting me that if I put myself in God's hands, he's not going to drop me. So Krishna says the one who has done that is Same Yukta Tamo Mataha, is connected to me in the highest sense. In other words, is the greatest yogi. So anyway, I could go on quoting these verses till you can't stand it anymore. But so getting back, you see people start leaving. Excuse me. Oh, I think someone. So getting back to your question, devotion by love, you understand someone. If you really love someone and they return your love, you can know that person in a way that no one else can know them. There are privileges. There's privileged knowledge between people who really love each other. And it's the same thing spiritually. It's the same thing spiritually. I mean, someone may show off to you that they're very intellectual, or I can do this, watch me do that, like little children, watch me. But ultimately, the way you truly know God is by love, is by loving God. And so that's bhakti yoga. The word yoga means that it's not just emotional, but there's a disciplined practice. That's what the word yoga here indicates. That because if you're serious about anything, you take up a disciplined practice. If you want to be a serious musician, athlete, if you go to law school, that's really something in our family. If you want to be a lawyer, or if an artist, if you want to be an artist, you study. For example, I published a novel a year or two ago, and I did my best, but I took it as a serious career. Like if suddenly for some inconceivable reason, let's say I wanted to be a dentist at my age in life. But let's say if you really want to be good at something, you practice it. And so I took up novel writing. I read lots of books about it. I studied. I have a novel writing guru. It was, of course, Jane Austen. And so I studied literature. I practiced. And I just did my best. So yoga means a practice. And one last point, maybe just to give you an extremely long-winded answer to your question, and that is that Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita, at several critical points in the Gita, uses another word for bhakti yoga, which is very interesting. That is buddhi yoga. Because buddhi means rational intelligence. Your ability to analyze things, buddhi, and of course the same word root from which you get Buddha. And so the real practice of bhakti yoga, although it means that you're developing your love, you're learning how to love. I mean, just like parents. My brothers and I were very fortunate. I think we had really amazing, loving parents. And I remember, like my father's birthday, my mom would take us, usually Save-On, right? Save-On drugstore. Take us to this store in our neighborhood, and we'd buy a gift for our father. And then my mother's birthday, our father would take us. And so looking back on that, they were teaching us to love, not out of vanity or ego, but because in order to grow up to be a healthy person, you have to learn how to love. You can't just be selfish. You can't just be like a very large percentage of the population today, a narcissist. But you have to learn to give. Or like in school, when we were in elementary school, we'd draw little pictures and then take them home to our parents. And so if you think about it, culture, when you grow up in a good culture, you're actually taught how to love. Or you could say that love is awakened. If you have good parents, you have a good family, if you live in a good community. And so bhakti yoga means, so getting back to your question, will the real Maha-bharata please stand up? So we have the Bhagavatam, and we're fortunate because there are centuries and centuries of very learned devotional commentaries in the Bhagavatam by great Sanskrit scholars who also love God. So we have all those commentaries, we have a tradition, we had Prabhupada, we had our own teacher, who was very much in that parampara, very much in that tradition of devotional scholars. And then I looked at the Maha-bharata text, and a little common sense can come in very handy also. Little comment, just to give one example. there's one story in the Mahabharata, this famous story, where there's this girl, Satyavati. I mean, she's very, very beautiful. But she's stuck. She's in this village of fisher ladies. And she's very unhappy because she has this, I mean, genetically, she's actually a princess. She actually is a princess who had to be hidden there to protect her life, save her life from some real danger. And so at one point, she meets this great king, Shantanu, who's the king of the Kuru dynasty, which is the greatest dynasty of its time. And they fall in love and they marry. But this whole thing is just described in the Maha-bharata, literally in like 2 sentences or something. Like King Shantanu was wandering in the forest, hunting. He saw this incredibly beautiful girl. He wanted her. He asked her father for her hand. And that's it. And then, of course, a bunch of other unexpected things happen. But if you approach this as a historian, I mean, we know that there really was a King Shantanu. He really did marry Satyavati. And a lot of them, in fact, they are direct ancestors of the Pandavas, Arjuna, and even related to Krishna ultimately. But so the question I ask myself as a historian is, what the heck is Shantanu doing hundreds of miles from his own kingdom? It's just like today, heads of state, like the president, let's say the prime minister of England, doesn't just show up somewhere in Miami Beach or something without telling anybody. So what was he doing there? And why did he really marry her? And because for one thing, kings didn't marry fishing girls. So how did he know who she really was? And there are actually answers to all these things. And so I looked at all these stories, and a lot of times it doesn't make sense. The story as it's given, but it's like people in the tradition, it's sacred, it's holy, and they just kind of go with it, and they don't stop to think that this doesn't make sense. Like, why is this happening? How did it happen? So there's like dozens and dozens of things like that. So it turns out that Satyavati, very quickly, was actually the only daughter of the emperor of the world, because the emperor at that point was not in Hastinapur, the usual imperial capital, had been shifted to Chedi, which is about maybe like 300 miles south of Delhi. And so why was it shifted? We're not told that, but you can figure it out if you study the geopolitical reality of the time, what was going on. If you put all the puzzle pieces together, to a historian, it becomes obvious why the capital was shifted. And then what was he doing there? That's related to the fact that he had lost his wife, and he had lost a wife that he was very much in love with, who was literally a goddess. And he was lamenting and grieving, and therefore, I understood he went incognito, and that's how he could actually travel. Why did he want to marry her? First of all, because he did fall in love with her, but also, it turns out it was a marriage between the 2 most powerful dynasties in the world at the time. And why was that important? Because the earth had been invaded. And so, anyway, if I tell you too much, you may not pay full price for my book. You may get a used copy on Amazon. So, to prevent that from happening, but suffice it to say, and now I'm really going to get pretentious and stupid, as a professionally trained historian, what I'm doing is looking at all these stories, and so there's all kinds of details and facts. Some are geographic, some are political, some are psychological, some are just historical. And they're just, in the corrupted Mahabharata, they're kind of like spread all over, and you've got to trace them down, put them all together, and then suddenly this picture begins to emerge, and it becomes obvious what really happened. And so but in order to keep myself from really going off the rails, all that I'm doing within the perimeter, the narrative perimeter of the Bhagavatam. So I can't go, really far off. And I'm putting together all the different versions. Some of the versions are just, how should I put it? It's almost like after a while you can kind of see it, like, nah. Because some of them are not relevant. Some of the different versions give, let's say, variant details that are totally irrelevant to the main story. Because the people that, let's say, put those stories in, the original reciters, who were called suttas, by the way, they were not concerned with the issues. For example, because I promised I would answer all the questions tonight, but obviously, like the Terminator said, I lied. So, because to understand all this, you have to look at the history of historiography. In other words, if you look, let's say, at the Greco-Roman civilization, they had a very different idea of why you write history. And if you look at the ancient Sanskrit culture, their concept was more like the Greco-Roman than it is like today. With the scientific revolution, say, roughly around the 1600s, well, history used to be simply to teach moral values and to, sort of roughly tell what happened, but no one cared that much if it was literally true. To give an example, there was a great Roman writer who was a personal friend of the first emperor, Augustus Caesar. His name was Virgil. You may have heard of Virgilius. So Virgil was this great, perhaps the greatest Roman historian, and he wrote a very famous book called the Aeneid. He did it like as a gift to the emperor. Now, the Aeneid tells, and this is a very good example of how people used to think of history. What the Aeneid, it describes the history of the great Roman Empire. And he explains that at the Battle of Troy, and I'll explain why that's so important, why he has to begin at the Battle of Troy. At the Battle of Troy, when the Trojans were losing, not to be confused with the USC, when the Trojans were losing, one Trojan prince escaped. His name was Aeneas. That's why the book's called the Aeneid. He escaped. So he was the last surviving royal blood of Troy. And he sailed around through the Bosporus into the Mediterranean. He went to North Africa, had an affair with an North African princess, eventually came to Italy and founded the city of Rome. Now, is there any what we would call academic historical evidence? No. But why were the Romans, including the emperor, very happy to accept that as the history? First of all, because at that time, although Rome had become the preeminent military power, the preeminent cultural power was Greece. It's like in America. America is the biggest military power, but classical literature is European literature. Classical music is European music. And you see, like in the expensive parts in LA, like when I lived in like north of Montana, and you go to these fancy shishi boutiques, and it's all about when I was in Paris. And so even though France can't compare to their military power, but you get prestige points if you put on a show of what you did last time you were in Paris or some other European place. So that was exactly the relationship between Rome and Greece. Rome was the military power, all the cultural prestige was Greek, and Greek was the ancient civilization. So therefore, as Rome really began to rise in power and became an empire, they wanted their own cultural prestige. They didn't always want to borrow from Greece. And so therefore, they needed a creation story, like where do we come from, that had the same prestige as the Greeks, because the Greeks' great epic of where we come from was, of course, Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey. So that's why the founder of Rome had to be on the same level as the ancient Greeks. So it was a Trojan prince. And he came and had an affair in North Africa, because at that point Rome controlled North Africa. And then, then he came and he founded the city of Rome. which gave a pedigree, a historical status equal to the Greeks. Did that really happen? God only knows. Did the Romans care if it really happened? No, not at all. It gave them what they wanted. The emperor loved it. So that was the concept of history. And if you look at even ancient India, historical detail was important, but so people didn't write history. But after the scientific revolution, you needed scientific history. We have to know exactly what happened. You have to prove everything you say. And that's why, for example, in German, they say the historische Wissenschaft, the historical science, what we call, it's like academic history, they call historical science. And so, so therefore, my concern, like, what's the real history? What really happened? Because I'm very much, a modern person in that sense. And I really care about the actual history. And I think that so does everybody else that may read the book. We really care about what actually happened. We're not simply going to, it's because I care about it, myself, because if I want to attract readers who are not already cult members, if I want to attract new cult members, then, if I claim that this is a history, I have to really defend it. This is real history. But if you look at all the text variations in the different versions of the Maha-bharata, that's not what they're concerned with. That's totally not their concern. They're talking about all kinds of other things about the history. So therefore, what I'm doing, hopefully in service, is to take what I've learned from my expensive education, what I've learned about historiography, I'm applying that to the Maha-bharata, taking all kinds of hints from the Bhagavatam and, like story corrections, and then just really diving deep into that historical period. What was the geography? What was the political situation? And what did it feel like to be alive then? So I think, okay, if I was alive back then, if I was King Shantanu, what would I be thinking? And this is actually based on something else I said yesterday, which I won't repeat completely, mercifully, and that is that the idea that we can't really understand each other, we can't really reach across cultures, we can't reach across historical time, I think is a bunch of garbage. Or if it's true, it's only true for people that aren't very bright. Because we're all souls. We're all, and there's a universality. It doesn't matter what kind of body you got. Your gender, your age, your ethnicity, your race, that's just the costume you're wearing. It's almost, there actually are human beings, I swear to God, you probably know this is true, that judge you by the clothes you wear. Like, is that fashionable? Is that not fashionable? That's about, getting to the surface of the surface. But among people who I would say are, in contrast to that, civilized human beings, obviously we don't judge people by the clothes they wear. And Krishna says in the Gita that our temporary body is like clothes. He used the word vasansi, which in Sanskrit means clothes. Dehi noasmin jata dehe, just as in this body, the embodied soul, Dehi noasmin jata dehe kumaran jomana jara. Anyways, I won't go all Sanskrit, but so therefore, those people thousands of years ago in a different part of the world, they were souls like us. And we can look past their bodies, past the superficial cultural trappings, and connect to them directly as souls. And I am absolutely convinced that that's what's happening in my life. That I'm connecting with these people. I'm giving them credit for common sense. I'm assuming that they do what normal, rational people do in situations like that. And some of the people back then are irrational. And so, of course, you give them room to be irrational and crazy, because there were irrational people back then. But as far as the good people, the women and the men, who obviously were intelligent, they were learned, they were reasonable, They did things because it's the right thing to do. I don't think it's very hard to figure out. If you really reconstruct the geopolitical, economic, psychological context, they do what normal people do. And everything. And once I started doing that, it sort of became like, what's the word? It just started expanding, because once I understood who these people are, it becomes obvious who the other people are. And it really was like that joy when you finally start to put the puzzle together and all the pieces start fitting together. And what comes out is this incredible picture, which is believable, plausible, powerful, and actually rationally explains everything that happened. So in that sense, this is kind of like the biggest project of my life. So I'm having a great time. And I think it's really coming out in this spectacular way. And the, you know, by the mercy of God, I don't take credit for it, not even, you know, secretly. And I mean, publicly, of course, I'm not going to take credit for it, 'cause otherwise I'll seem like a hypocrite. But even privately, I don't take credit for it. And so I think that's the question. I think it's possible by connecting to the parampara, this chain coming from Krishna, by just doing all the work, doing the secular work of reconstructing history, looking at all the text variants, and then, you know, a little help from my guru friend. I think it's possible. And I think I'm personally convinced that's what's happening. It's actually kind of emerging. It's sort of like literary archaeology.
That's a great answer.
Brief, but
Short and sweet.
short and sweet. So any other questions?
You have a question.
Yes.
Microphone?
It's
Is
not
microphone
on.
No,
It's
right here,
not-
correct, sir.
But yours is not working at all.
My microphone is not working?
Yeah, no, yes, sir.
I don't think so.
It is when it
No.
comes closer. No nos escuchan.
Say oye?
Nope. No. Yours is, I don't think it's working either.
Check.
Portuguese?
Maybe slow.
São eles.
Okay.
Now it's good.
Okay.
Now.
So, anyone,
Prabhu there, right
Nimai.
there. Nimai right here.
oh, Nimai? Then Svetlana.
Yeah.
Svetlana, you're second in line. First Nimai and then Svetlana. So if you want to ask questions, please step over everyone and you know, and then make your way, or step on everyone. And so, Nimai, you will it.
Es referente a los dos versos que citó ayer de Rita, sorry for asking in Spanish.
No, y puedes hablar en español, después yo traduzco por un precio razonable.
Gracias, brother. Los dos versos que citó del Gita ayer sobre el conocimiento en la bondad,
sí,
y el conocimiento en la pasión. Actualmente podemos ver que todo está enfocado siempre en las diferencias. O sea, de hecho, el conocimiento...
Sí, en pasión.
En pasión, exactamente. Entonces, con estos versos del Bhagavad Gita, nosotros como devotos, o como tratando de seguir la instrucción del Bhagavad Gita, ¿cómo podemos unificar todas esas diferencias a través de la bondad que Krishna está explicando en el verso 18-20 que usted comentaba ayer?
Yesterday I quoted those two Gita verses that when your consciousness is in virtue and goodness, then you see the differences. I mean, it's obvious that there are, you know, genders, there are races or ethnicities, but you see it's just a covering. And so you see within every being, there's the same soul. And so you see the oneness. You see the oneness within the variety. Whereas people in what is called Rajoguna, that this quality of passion in the negative sense, of being sort of selfish and ambitious and attached. So that, for example, you're my friend, so you don't have to follow the rules. If I'm in government, if you're not my friend, even if you follow the rules, you're not going to get anything, which is characteristic of corrupt societies. So, and so your question was, if you're a spiritual practitioner, how do you deal with this?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, obviously we have to, for example, we do make practical distinctions in the sense of there's two words in Sanskrit. One is Vyavaharika, the other is Paramarthika. Vyavaharika, the word Vyavahara, just means normal social intercourse. Like, for example, let's say I'm filling out an application for something. I don't know, whatever. I'm filling out an application, and it says date of birth. And I put, quote the Bhagavad Gita, Najayate, the soul is never born, the soul is eternal. Probably won't get the credit card. So that's Vyavahara, which means ordinary social intercourse. So if you are just doing world, you have to have a little common sense and just go with it. But then Paramartha means the highest meaning, like the ultimate meaning of things. So whereas I may put my date of birth, or whatever, but if I'm giving a lecture on spiritual philosophy, I'm going to say, well, as an eternal soul, my body was born, I came into the body, but I actually, as Krishna says, Najayate Mriyate Va Kadachan. The soul is never born and never dies. So it depends. If you're dealing with spiritual matters, you want to be precise. If you're just doing ordinary worldly things, then you have to be practical. And so, yes, that's it. So Svetlana, representing Russia.
Hello, my name is Svetlana. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Hello, my name is Svetlana. I'm from Russia. So my question is, do kshatriyas exist right now in our world, or it's just a bunch of shudras with weapons?
Good question. You would call that in Sanskrit prema, which means tough love. Svetlana is referring to the fact that there is sort of a God-given system. Krishna says, Chaturvarnya Myaskrishtam, which there are people who are brahmanas, and this is not hereditary, by the way, it depends on your qualification. People who by nature are teachers, by nature they lead people in religion and spirituality. That's just their nature to do that. And they're called brahmanas. And there are kshatriyas, which you mentioned, who are sort of by nature, they govern. There are people whose nature is to govern, to protect people physically. Therefore, they're also warriors. And then there are vaishyas, which means they're inclined to business, commerce, agriculture, just producing. They're the productive class. And then the shudras are people who basically need to work for somebody. If they can't find a job and have to sort of make it on their own, they're not going to live as well as if they can find a good job. And so people have these, you find these four classes, by the way, all around the world. Whether it's Japan, whether it's Europe, they have different names for it. As you know, in French, they called it in France, or in English, they called them the estates, lead up to the French Revolution. The first estate, which was clergy, the second estate, which was royalty, which directly maps onto Brahman and Kshatriya, and so on. So you find it around the world. It's natural. As far as nowadays, yeah, there are people whose inclination is to be a teacher. There are people whose inclination is to protect, to govern. The problem is the world is so messed up in this sort of industrial, post-industrial age that natural vocations, it's hard to find a place for them. For natural vocations. So the problem, I think, is the context, not that people don't have these natures. Gandhini.
So there's a verse in the Bhagavad Gita we all know very well, and everybody who reads it is in different stages of their spiritual advancement. They take a different interpretation of this. So we'll read it, and you'll know it, I'm sure. And I will give you some of the interpretations that they give me, and I would like to know exactly what this interpretation. This is the 240. In this endeavor, there is no loss or diminution, and a little advancement on this path can protect one from the most dangerous type of fear. So some people say that the fear is fear of death. Other people is fear of hell. And then other people think it's fear of forgetting Krishna. So those are the three things I have heard.
Fear of getting Krishna?
No, of forgetting Krishna.
Oh, forgetting Krishna. Okay.
So what is the meaning
Okay, first let's do a literal translation. The verse begins, Neha Vikrama Nashosti. Because Krishna is talking about Dharma. The topic is Dharma. And he says, Na iha, not in this world. Abhikrama, Abhikrama means like you really try for something. Abhikrama. So in this world, when you really, when you really try to practice Dharma in the highest sense, in the sense of, because just a word about Dharma. I know you know this word very well. So I'm going to tell you what the word Dharma really means. The word Dharma comes from a Sanskrit root, which is, technically you pronounce it dhur. It's like DH and then the vowel R, not the consonant R. So dhur, and this root means to sustain, to hold something. And so, like for example, Krishna holds, or say the goddess of fortune holds a lotus, so she's called Padmadhara. She holds a lotus. Or Krishna is Chakradhara, he holds a chakra. So this is the word Dhara. So the word Dharma, in its original meaning, because if you look at older Sanskrit, what the word originally meant, it means a quality or an activity which sustains the identity of something, the essential identity of something. So that, for example, a poetic way of saying someone died in the Maha-bharata is that they'll say something like Tankala Dharma Tyagat, that the Dharma of time overcame that person. And so what is the Dharma of time itself? That it destroys everything. Just like in Bhagavad Gita, like you look at the end of 9 innings, or if you look at the final condition of anything, physical thing in this world, the final condition is it stops existing. And so, for example, that famous verse in the Bhagavad Gita where Krishna shows his cosmic form and Arjuna says, Ko bhavan rudra rupa, who are you in this frightening form, this awful form? And Krishna says, Kalos me, time I am. Lokachaya Krit, destroyer of the worlds. Interestingly, when the scientist Oppenheimer saw the first explosion of an atomic bomb, and he feared, what would come of this, he quoted that verse in the Bhagavad Gita. When he saw the first atomic bomb explosion, he said, time I am, destroyer of the worlds. But getting back to the word Dharma, so Dharma means an essential quality which defines something, which sustains its identity. So, for example, there's something called Raja Dharma, which royal, like a king's Dharma. Oh, that's all right. It doesn't bother me.
Where is the music stand? We used that yesterday. It was very helpful.
So anyway, so Raja Dharma.
Markandeya.
No, bring it this side.
It's over here. No, here.
Over here.
Markandeya.
Thank you. Yeah, just put on the yeah, that'll be perfect. Okay, done. So for example, if someone is a king, and to be considered a real king, someone who's really like an authentic king, they have to follow Raja Dharma. Because Dharma means the activities, the duties, the characteristics that sustain a king as a real king. So that's what the word Dharma originally meant. And therefore, so it has a material sense. For example, if you have a particular role in society, as a king, as a merchant, as a teacher, you have your Dharma. So Brahma Dharma means the Dharma of teachers. Raja Dharma, the Dharma of kings. There are special duties for ladies called Stri Dharma. They have like their own exclusive Dharma, certain things they do. And so ultimately though, ultimately there is what is called, and this is very famous in India, everyone knows this, and there is Sanatana Dharma. Sanatana means eternal. In other words, it's not the essential characteristic or activity of a person in terms of the particular body they happen to have, but it's of the soul. It's the soul's Dharma. It's who you ultimately are. And that is called Sanatana Dharma. So Indians who know that the word Hindu is sort of a modern invention in the last 200 years, 150, 200 years. And so Indians were a little more educated. What they'll say is our religion is Sanatana Dharma. You know, we follow these eternal principles. So getting back to this verse that you asked about, Krishna is talking about asya dharmasya, of this dharma. And he's talking about this ultimate dharma, the dharma of the soul. And so therefore he says that in this life, if you really if you make a real endeavor to practice the soul's dharma, then there is no nihabhikramanasya. That endeavor is never lost. It's not like, you know, like you bought bitcoins or something and then, and the next day, you know. Anyway, so kind of revealed my own thoughts on that. So Krishna says that if you try to practice this dharma, this spiritual dharma, that endeavor will never be lost because it's your eternal credit. Whatever you're able to accomplish, it's like, let's say you take some classes at a college and then you drop out, but that's on your record. You still have those credits if you go back to college. And so then he says, pratyavayo navidyate, and it will never perish. You'll never lose it. And then, anyway, pratyavayo, I won't go into all the technical details of the Sanskrit word, but it's never lost. It will never decrease. You always have those credits. Asya dharmasya, of this dharma. Nehabhikramanashosti pratyavayo navidyate. And Krishna says, sualpamapi, literally even very little of this dharma. Even if you try a little bit to practice the soul's dharma, bhakti, love, devotion, even if you do a little bit of it, sualpamapi asya dharmasya trayate, it saves you from mahato bhaya, which means not only the great fear. The word bhaya in Sanskrit, which is often, it also means the danger. It means danger or the psychological response to danger, which is fear. It means both. So therefore, it means not only the greatest fear, but it saves you from the greatest danger, from the great danger. The word maha, which by the way we have in English, is magna, like magna, that's Sanskrit maha. So what is that great danger? I think it's kind of sort of scholastic in the pejorative sense of the term, kind of like unnecessary debate. I mean, obviously the great danger is the things you mentioned, they're all kind of the same thing. If we have this human life, because if one has a human life and doesn't use it doesn't get any spiritual credit, there's a danger in the next life, you'll go down. And we know a lot of people, I mean, or maybe they're not our friends, but a lot of people in this country who, as we know, if you compare them to animals, it's kind of like you're not being fair to animals. And so, you get what you pay for. So if a person wants to live like an animal in the sense of being selfish, being violent, or just being uncaring, so that's a real danger. And obviously, if one goes down into a lower species of life, then you also lose the chance to know God. So it's really all the same. I mean, people argue about these things because they have nothing better to do.
But for a devotee would be to forget Krishna, no?
But it's all the same. Yeah, because to forget Krishna means that, so the danger is, but what Krishna is saying is that's not a danger. Because if you make even a little advancement on this path, then you do not risk that danger. That's the whole point. So, time's up. Any other question? Okay, well. Oh, okay. Infomercial alert. As you know, I'm publishing books, and we want all of you to put aside frivolous concerns like how you're going to pay for your house, or buy healthy food, or take care of your families. Once that all those frivolous concerns, and buy very large quantities of my books. Or if you can't go all the way, I buy some books. My brother, actually, Alan, I think you bought 10 books, 10 Gitas. So we have the books displayed somewhere, don't we?
Yes.
On the entrance, we have all these books. So we really need to get these books out. So please help us do that. And we will be watching who leaves without taking books. And
We have cameras already.
and there will be consequences. But anyway, take as many books as you can. So, any other question? Ixhuacu, ¿hay un micrófono aquí?
Yes.
¿Puedo hablar fuerte?
Sí, él habla fuerte. Él hace todo fuerte.
Sí.
Es tu cuate.
También recibo golpes fuertes suyos. Usted explica cómo usted y otros acharyas previos, cómo la Bhagavad Gita es un texto no corrupto, a diferencia de textos como el Maha-bharata.
Sí.
Explican que es un texto corrupto. Entonces, ¿cuál sería la manera de demostrar, o por lo menos tratar de explicar en el ámbito un poquito académico, internacional, que es un texto no corrupto la Bhagavad Gita?
Los académicos lo saben. I said that the Bhagavatam is relatively a pure text compared to Maha-bharata, so how can we explain that? But the scholars themselves explain it. They have a critical edition of the Bhagavatam that has about 100 times less points, at least, than the Maha-bharata, and the text variations that are there are trivial. Whereas the text variations of the Maha-bharata are, often not trivial. So from the academic point of view, you can see it. It's obvious. ¿Entendiste, verdad? So any other question? We're having a dinner after this?
Yeah.
So I think a lot of you are highly motivated not to ask questions or not to have other people ask questions. Yes. ¿Quién? Oh, Sachitanoy Mahaprabhu. Del micrófono.
Ahí está el micrófono.
Viejo amigo.
Gracias.
¿Verdad?
Sí, claro. Maharaj, that verse that you quote in the Bhagavad Gita, 648, sometimes...
647.
647. Of all yogis, the one who is topmost. Okay. So sometimes we might, devotees, practitioners, become a little bit, wow, that's too much. It's really high. I don't think that. I want something maybe lower. So
no, because actually it's easier. Because bhakti yoga means, instead of trying to be a show off or I'm a great yogi, you actually take help from God. You actually because there's reciprocation. Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, Jejatam mam prapadyante. As everyone approaches me, I reciprocate with them. Interestingly, because you know about bhajan, the word that Krishna says that I reciprocate is the word bhajan. He says bhajami, which is the first person singular, I budge, in the sense of, bhajan. Because what Krishna is saying is that if you try to understand him, he will help you. And so it's actually more difficult to be a show-off. No, don't help me. I want to do it by myself. That's the difficult thing.
So when I was leading to my question, so there was one famous lecture that Srila Prabhupada gave one time. When he was giving a lecture, and he said that to go back to Godhead, you need to be 100%. And he looked at the devotees, and everybody was down. Then he said, okay, 80%. And the devotees were still not cheered. Okay, 70%. So now my question,
But what Prabhupada means by that, I think you have to put that within a rational context.
Yeah, so my question
I mean,
is-
obviously, you can't have people, hanging out in the spiritual world who are 30% polluted, or 30%, lusty and greedy, and it's just, it would, you can't crash the gates of heaven. So therefore, what I understand Prabhupada to mean there is that, even if you're this percentage or that percentage, that, you'll get a lift and you'll eventually make it. That you'll get help and you'll eventually make it.
So that was my question.
Yeah, and there's actually a very interesting verse, which I will quote. Will this ever end? In the second canto of the Bhagavatam, which I find it's a very sort of like paradoxical statement. The Sanskrit is akama sarva kamo va moksha kamo dharati tivrena bhakti yogeni yajeta purusham param. It says that, the word kama. Sometimes it's taken to mean sex, like Kama Sutra. Not my bedtime reading, but anyway. So but the word kama literally in Sanskrit means desire. It literally, and it can actually be used to mean spiritual desire also, but it just, so like for example, the past participle, if you say desired, is kanta. So you have many names of Krishna like Radha Kanta, the beloved of Radha, or Krishna Kanta, and so on. But the word kama, so used here in the context of material desire, so akama means a person has no material desire, like a self-realized soul. So the Bhagavatam says, akama, sarva kama va. If someone has no material desire, or every material desire, moksha kama, or if they simply desire liberation, salvation, moksha. Moksha kama udarati, and that which sort of means literally, if they're really broad-minded, if they really have deep intelligence, then tivrena bhakti yogena yeta purusham param. Then with intense bhakti yoga, that person should worship the supreme person, or God. And so the question is, how can you give the same instruction to the most advanced person and the least advanced person? The person has no material desire, and the person has every material desire. And the answer is, I always have the answers, right? You didn't think I was ever going to say, I don't know, right? You know I'm never going to say that. And so, so typical resident. So, because the idea is that to surrender to God or worship God doesn't mean you have to be a great yogi. It simply means you try your best. It simply means it's like they always say in yoga classes, don't look at the person next to you. You're not competing with anyone. Because, typically the person next to me is doing all these stretches and I'm like, my hamstrings are kind of made of solid steel, unbendable steel. So it's like that. If you do your best, then you're a great success. Whatever your best is, if you're being sincere and doing your best, then that's surrender. That means you're giving yourself to God, just whatever your best is. And you'll gradually make advancement. Negocio?
Gracias.
Yes, we have an international group here. Ashisha, Gaurani.
Okay, we have the microphone. 1 second. Coming.
We have people from many different countries. Yes.
If we open up the door, as you mentioned yesterday, that Maha-bharata has been changed or corrupted, whatever. But then you mentioned Bhagavad Gita is pure.
Yes.
And Bhagavad Gita is part of Maha-bharata.
Yes. Good question. I'll explain that.
And just to finish my question.
Yeah.
You mentioned.
If I didn't understand your question, you get a prize.
You also mentioned when you were saying how it came to your mind you start this project.
Yes.
That this could be a good way to make people devotees. I see devotees enjoy Mahabharata stories.
Yes.
But since yesterday I was thinking, what is your Mahabharata stories are the most unbelievable stories. Sons of gurus, and how do you think that could make people devotees all those stories?
Boy, he faked me out. So, okay, first of all, if the Mahabharata is corrupt, what about the Bhagavad Gita? The Bhagavad Gita is not corrupt, even from the academic point of view, and there are reasons for that. If you look at why the Mahabharata was corrupted, because it's just too big to memorize. It's this huge book. Whereas Bhagavad Gita is very short. So for the Brahmins, for the sages back then, to memorize the Bhagavad Gita was nothing. It was like a trivial thing because it's so short in terms of what was required of them. So the Bhagavad Gita was very easily memorized and was memorized, and it had extraordinary importance because everyone knows it's the spiritual heart of the Maha-bharata, and spiritual heart really of the whole tradition. And so therefore it was memorized, it was very easy to memorize, and because of its sacred position, people were strongly committed to not changing it. It's like, don't mess with the Bhagavad Gita. You may have your own theory about, why Shantanu married Satyavati, but don't mess with the Bhagavad Gita. So therefore it was preserved, and it was preserved intact. And then as far as the stories, I'm glad you brought that up, because one of the things I'm really doing is not unnecessarily telling tall tales. In other words, if you look at that, according to all of these literatures, there are 4 great planetary ages, which are called yugas. So we're in Kali Yuga, which is kind of like, the absurd yuga, where people are very degraded. And then Krishna appeared at Dwapara Yuga, which was an earlier age. People were more advanced in various ways. Before that was Treta Yuga and then Satya Yuga, the age of truth. So, just do it. Just do it. Just put it down right there. You don't have to pass it back around the room. So people did have greater powers back then. It's very interesting because there is a unanimous agreement among ancient writers, because Krishna appeared roughly, say 5,000 years ago. So we have writings from Greece, ancient Greece, which were halfway back to Krishna, about 2,500 years ago. Such as, for example, there's Homer, there's Hesiod. And what's interesting is these ancient writers, and we don't really know exactly what's going on. I mean, we have some idea of the ancient history, but there were all kinds of things going on back then that we don't really understand. But those ancient writers, halfway back to Krishna, they all say that in the previous age, people had powers that we don't have. And they use the same, just like the Golden Age, Satya Yuga, the age of truth. It's called the Golden Age, the Silver Age, the Bronze Age, and the Iron Age, the age of Kali. And that's exactly what the ancient Greeks called it. That's what it's called in ancient Sanskrit culture. That's exactly what. So all people that lived thousands of years ago agree on this point, that there was actually a higher civilization. So in that sense, it's very interesting. One time I was taking a class at Harvard, and we had a guest speaker who was Professor Richard Meadows, I think his name was, who was one of the leading archaeologists in America, in charge of the American archaeological mission in Harappa, sort of the Harappan civilization, Indus Valley civilization. And so I asked him about a place called Mehrgarh. Mehrgarh is an archaeological site. It's now in Pakistan. Previously, it was in Bharata. And what's interesting about that, is that the civilization goes back, I forget exactly, 9,000 years. So like thousands of years before Krishna. And so the artifacts that have been discovered in Mayurgarh tend to be simple. They're definitely human artifacts, things typically for cooking or digging, maybe some kinds of, rudimentary weapons or whatever to defend themselves. So I asked this archaeologist, I said, based on the physical remains, the remains we have from Mayurgarh, isn't it possible that the people who lived there were spiritually very advanced? For example, lived voluntarily simple lives, or that they had a very sophisticated culture, but they engaged in what is called voluntary simplicity. In other words, they don't live simply because they can't afford to buy stuff, but because they choose to live simply because of their goals in life. And he said, yeah, of course, absolutely. Years old could have been a very culturally advanced civilization that didn't need to write things down because they had fantastic memories. They were actually in many ways more intelligent, and they were engaged in more spiritual pursuits. So we don't really know, by mundane scholarship, we don't really know what was going on back then. But getting back to your question, which I didn't forget at my age. So I'm not shying away from some of the descriptions that clearly show an advanced civilization. At the same time, some things are just a little over the top, and I think they're text intrusions, and I can tell you later to give you examples of that. Here's an example I'm giving. Actually, I'm just finishing the foreword to the first volume of Maha-bharata. Imagine this scenario. There's some kind of real cataclysm. It could be nuclear war. It could be another big meteor hits Earth, or asteroid like 66 million years ago, the one that basically destroyed the dinosaurs, totally changed the Earth. And so imagine some kind of cataclysm, environmental, astronomic, warfare. What if it just stopped raining on Earth? And so let's say the civilization as we know it is destroyed. Civilization as we know it is destroyed, but the human race survives. The human race survives. And in this dystopian future, human life is radically simplified because international commerce breaks down, technology breaks down, it's a dystopian future, and life again becomes very simple, as it was for many thousands of years. Of years, technology basically didn't change. So imagine that happens again. And let's say thousands of years from now, there is not another scientific revolution. People do not rediscover technology we now know. And life goes on as it did for thousands of years in a very simple way. And let's say those people find in sort of like whatever archaeological ruins there are, they find some books. And these books talk about yes, if you point on this picture and click, that a hill will blow up, or a rocket will go into space, or the blind can see, or the limp can walk. They read this, and they have absolutely no analog. There's nothing analogous in their culture, and so they naturally conclude primitive mythology. Primitive mythology. Because we know that there are no such things. That, according to Maha-bharata and the Bhagavatam, is exactly what happened. We are the primitive people for all of our technology. And what we call technology, mythology, these great yogis and intercourse, rather vigorous social intercourse between people of Earth and people of other planets, as all ancient civilizations actually describe. that what modern sort of know-it-all academics describe as mythology is really an accurate description of a more advanced world that was destroyed. So that's the picture we actually get from ancient Sanskrit literature. And I'm not going to be the one to say they're wrong. In fact, I'm betting my Vedic marbles on their being right. So that's how I'm approaching the text. So I'm not, but at the same time, there are clear interpolations, clear text that was put in, which is almost farcical. I mean, I could tell you later, like exactly what parts the Mahabharata's in, but if you read the Sanskrit, it's like, it's almost silly. It's like, it really is like fables. Whereas the more truly historical parts sound like history, and because you have to know the distinction between magic and mysticism. The difference between a magical worldview and a mystical worldview is that, magical worldview, Harry Potter. So in a magical worldview is basically non-rational. It's non-rational, it's not systematic. For example, you take an old squirrel's tail and you put it in lemonade and you sing kafa, rabah, ting, ting, wama, and then your enemy turns into an alligator. And so, like stuff like that, like, Hogwarts. So, but if you look at the magical worldview, there are not discernible, consistent laws of nature. In a mystical worldview, just like in the modern, let's say, empirical worldview, actually, there are reliable, systematic, consistent laws of nature. The difference is there are higher laws. There are all the laws that we know, the physical laws, but there are also higher laws which are just as systematic as the laws we know. So most of the Maha-bharata, the part I'm using, gives in essence, a mystical worldview where there are high order laws, but they're just as reliable, consistent, and understandable as the lower laws. Whereas some interpolations give not a mystic worldview, but sort of like an incoherent magical thing, which really is inconsistent with everything. It's inconsistent with the Maha-bharata. It's inconsistent. I could give you many examples, but I won't take the time now, where clearly things happen that even contradict the Bhagavad Gita. They contradict all the higher order laws that are described elsewhere in the text. And so they're obviously interpolations, because after all, people made a living by reciting this. And just like, Harry Potter is so wildly popular, guess what? They had their Harry Potters back then. They had their magical fables that were best, that were really popular with common people. And so I think it's not so difficult. If you go deeply into the text and you understand all these things, it's actually not that hard to sort things out, which I say with my usual extreme humility. Yes.
Raj, did any of our acharyas ever have commentary on any?
Yes, Madhvacharya wrote a whole book on the Mahabharata in which he says the text is thoroughly corrupted. So, don't, as the Roman said, don't kill the messenger. So it's so yeah. And plus, again, the acharyas, they weren't concerned with this. Historicity was just not something they cared about. Because in the age they lived in, no one cared about it, but it's a big deal now. And if you look at the acharyas, each great acharya, great teacher, they deal with issues that are relevant in their time. So when I read the commentaries, say Sanskrit commentaries on, say, the Bhagavatam, you can see there were burning issues back then. There were huge debates that everyone cared about, but we don't care about those things nowadays. But the things we care about, they don't talk about. So to really follow them, we have to be relevant. So maybe we'll stop here. I think yeah. Are we having dinner tonight?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
So,
they're serving outside.
Don't go away now. You sat through the hard part. Now it gets to the easy part, eating. So, thank you all very much. Hare Krishna.
Tell us
A
something
menu. You
about
want a menu?
when you got took sannyas.
Yes.
Do you have a memory you could share with us about
Oh, can I do that
day?
tomorrow?
Yeah. Tomorrow, we got a Gayatri, then
Are
we
you
have
gonna
a video.
here tomorrow? Oh, when I took sannyas, I was really happy.
So we have Prashadam right now outside, and then we have a video going on.
Hey.
No, after Prashadam.
And then before we get the video, they can grab a plate and just sit in a chair to watch the video.
So Gayatri time, then grab your plates.